Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everybody, wherever you are. I would like to warmly welcome all of you joining us on today's webinar. My name, for those who were not in our previous webinar, is still Najat Rajdi, and I am delighted to be hosting this peer-to-peer webinar on the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse. As already announced, the webinar will highlight major developments in efforts to prevent and respond to sexual exploitation and abuse across the United Nations system in implementation of the Secretary General's new approach strategy. The main feature of this strategy is the creation of the mandate of the victim's rights advocate and system-wide efforts to integrate and institutionalize victim-centered approaches. The webinar will also update participants on implementation of the Interagency Standing Committee Plan to accelerate PSEA in humanitarian response, which aims to strengthen a victim-centered response from reporting, assistance provisions, and access to accountability. The victim's rights advocate is closely involved in monitoring implementation of the Interagency Standing Committee Plan. Our two panelists will help us all together as a humanitarian community to better understand the key changes that have taken place and efforts to strengthen victim-centered approaches to sexual exploitation and abuse in the humanitarian sector, our roles and responsibilities in this regard, and what else we can do, because we all have an individual responsibility to make sure that what has to be done is done. But just before introducing the speakers, who I really thank very much for availing themselves for this webinar, I would like to say a few words about the webinar and how it works for us to avoid any interruption in the broadcasting. So it will last for 60 minutes. During the first 20 minutes and so, I will be asking questions to our two speakers, and they will be providing us with their reflections on the topic. During the second part of the webinar, I will be taking questions from you that I will direct to the speakers. So could you please already start sending your questions to the following email address, support@un.org. And before we get started, please keep in mind that, of course, you should stay on mute through the course of this webinar, because otherwise we will have a problem with the bandwidth. And please have your camera turned off at all time again. Please use the chat box if ever you can. So for you to send your comments or your questions, and send the questions to the email address as already shared before, P2P support@un.org. And please know that we'll be running two polls during the course of this webinar. Your response is really very important for us in terms of getting new suggestions, but also in terms of better delivering on our future webinars. And this webinar will be recorded, and an edited version will be uploaded on to the website www.deliveredbetter.org, and we will share with you, the record. So coming back to the topic, I know that a lot have been said about that, and a lot of meetings were organized for that. But today we have really two top experts, but I would like also to say two top advocates, because that's really what they are doing on daily basis, and really addressing the fact that sexual exploitation and abuse is actually a major failure of protection and causes suffering to the victims and erodes their trust, and that of others we seek to serve as humanitarian. And as you all know, protection is really at the heart of our DNA as humanitarian. They also violate universally recognized international norms and standards. The aberrant conduct of a few should not, though, undermine the credibility of our organizations and tarnish the critical and vital work of thousands of women and men who uphold humanitarian principles and serve with pride and professionalism in very, very challenging, dangerous, and difficult settings. So to tell us more about what are we doing in our organizations about that, it's my great pleasure to introduce the panelists. I will start with Jen Connors. Mrs. Connors is the United Nations Victims' Rights Advocate on sexual exploitation and abuse, and I had the great pleasure to work with her in my previous life as humanitarian coordinator, and I can tell you she is a very pushy person and also a very frank and direct person. So don't hesitate to ask challenging questions. Previously, she served as a director of international advocacy for Amnesty International. From 1996 to 2015, she held various positions at the United Nations. Before joining the UN, she held posts in law schools at universities in the United Kingdom and Australia. Jen has published widely on UN human rights mechanisms, the human rights of women and children, and gender-based violence. Our second panelist is Isabella Castrogiovanni. Isabella is UNICEF Senior Coordinator on SEA and Workplace Abuse in the Office of the Executive Director, and she has been very active and very much committed during the UNICEF Championship for the PSEA. She is a political scientist and protection expert with over 20 years of experience with the United Nations in East Africa, Central and Southeast Asia, the Balkan region, and the Middle East. She holds a master's degree in political science and international relations from the University of Florence and the master's degree in international and comparative legal studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies. So now let me turn to the panelists so we get into the heart of the topic today. And I will start with you, Jen. Hi, Jen. So Jen, the first question is to you. Could you please briefly describe your role and mandate, because not everybody understanding the proper way, including what has been achieved across the UN system and remaining challenges to be addressed. Over to you, Jen. Well, looks that, technology is not always on our side. So let me turn to Isabella. Isabella, are you there?
Yes, yes. Hi, okay. Najat.
Hi. Well, while we will re-establish the communication with Jen, Isabella, I'll turn to you with a question. As I was saying, UNICEF was the PSEA champion in 2018 and 2019. Can you please tell us more about the priorities, major accomplishment during this time? Over to you, Isabella.
Thank you, Najat, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all colleagues, and I can see many friends also around the world online. Really exciting to see the level of participation is obviously a great testament to the commitment we all have to this universal agenda. So thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to contribute. Obviously, protection from sexual exploitation and abuse has been central to the work of the ISC for many years. The role of the champion has been constructed to serve really as a conduit to keep the issue high on the agenda of humanitarian leaders and the humanitarian community at large. During her tenure, UNICEF Executive Director Ms. Ford has really focused on accelerating action at the country level by by rallying and bringing together the humanitarian system around a set of common, tangible, and measurable priorities for implementation at the field level through the existing humanitarian coordinators system. And obviously in line with the common vision and approach around PSEA that has been, that was articulated in the IASC strategy on protection from sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual harassment in November of last year. So the focus, I mean, I really want to emphasize this notion of focusing on country-level results and resourcing country-level PSEA systems and services in order to support the senior leadership to accelerate action at the field level. I can see, Najat, that Jane is online, but would you like me to carry on? Najat?
Isabella, you just finished to address this question, and then
Okay, thank you.
Jane. Don't worry, thank you.
All right, all right. So because of this focus on field level results, let me just, in broad strokes, mention some of the key elements of the ISC plan for accelerating protection from sexual exploitation and abuse at the country level that was adopted in December of last year. So there are the plan articulates three key priority outcomes at the field level. One around safe and accessible reporting mechanisms. The second one around quality assistance for survivors of sexual exploitation and abuse, and the third one around prompt and survivor-centered investigation. The importance of having these three outcome areas is that these will help us also, will help the system in benchmarking and tracking progress against a common set of priorities and related indicators, which obviously will need to be adjusted depending on context on the ground. Let me briefly also mention an important mapping of country-level PSEA systems that was conducted late last year in 34 countries to identify critical capacity and resource gaps to deliver on this agenda. And this has provided us with a baseline that will help in benchmarking progress and making sure that we stay on track. There has been, you will see in some of the slides what the results of these, the key results of these mapping are, and which clearly show that the gaps are still significant in terms of reporting mechanisms, in terms of access to services for survivors, and in terms also of investigations. There has been also substantive progress during the last almost 2 years in addressing some of those gaps. So just a few concrete examples. There are 33 PSEA networks in out of the 34 countries, so that's already a great progress. There are 19 PSEA network led by PSEA coordinators. Many of these coordinators are reporting already to the humanitarian coordinators and are full-time positions. I really emphasize this aspect of a coordination structure because at the field level, because this is really critical to ensure we deliver on our accountabilities.
Thank you very much, Isabella. We'll get back to you so you can provide us more about, you know, those very important achievements, and you already provide us with the answer of one of the questions we got, which was about how many full-time PSEA coordinator we have, and actually you just say that we have 19 dedicated PSEA coordinators. So thank you very much, Isabella. Jen, I turn to you, and the question to you is really to explain and describe better your role and mandate, because it's not something that is very well known to everybody. and to tell us more about what has been concretely achieved across the UN system. And we'll get back to you and to Isabella later to talk about the challenges. Jen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Najat, and I hope the web series are on my side at the moment. Thank you for organizing the event. I'm delighted that everybody's with us in whatever time zone they're in, and I wish you all best wishes. I just wanted to backtrack. The Secretary General launched a new system-wide strategy to improve our response to sexual exploitation and abuse perpetrated by UN personnel. And I want to be very clear here. His approach is system-wide, and his approach pertains to all UN personnel, uniformed, civilian, international, and national. And we're not only talking about uniformed, and that's very important. There are 4 prongs to this strategy: a prioritization of the rights and dignity of victims, a focus on combating impunity, building multi-stakeholder networks of support, and reorienting our approach to strategic communications towards transparency, essentially. The centerpiece and the thing that is so different is this emphasis on victims' rights. And this requires us to understand the complex and lasting impact of sexual exploitation and abuse on victims, their families, and communities. It's quite revolutionary in a way because it shifts our gaze from the reputation of the organization as a whole, system-wide, and the conduct and discipline of UN personnel, and it prioritizes the rights of the women, men, and children whose dignity has been assaulted. Now, of course, the big difference, you can say this about victims' rights, but the big difference is the operationalization of this. And this is the role of the victims' rights advocate, which I'm very proud and, of course, very humbled to have. I'm to act as a global advocate for victims of sexual exploitation and abuse and seek to entrench a rights-based approach to prevention and response across the UN system. And I'll keep saying across the UN system because often there's a confusion that this might only be about peacekeeping. There are 4 field victims' rights advocates in the countries from which we've had the greatest number of allegations: Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, and South Sudan. And they reflect my role very, very operationally on the ground. Their role is also system-wide, and that's very important to underline. I've been working in this function for just a bit over 2 years, as have the advocates in the field. And of course, the big thing I had to do is carve out the role. Also, I had to engage in a lot of administration. And I saw the role essentially as a mechanism to provide legal accountability to victims, and therefore I prioritized giving them visibility and emphasizing at the core of this conduct, these wrongs, is a person who experiences hurt, fear, is often subject to reprisals, stigma, and exclusion from their families and communities. And I meet with victims on their own terms, and I can go into what they say to me, but of course those meetings are confidential. I have a very small office, and in terms of what have I done, which I'm sure that's interesting for many, I've got very limited funding, and I've been very selective in my priorities. And prime amongst this is general advocacy with across the UN, member states, the humanitarian and development sectors, the media, visits, and so on. I've got several projects in the pipeline. One big one is seeking to resolve paternity child support claims. The second is mapping support available to victims in 13 countries with differing UN presences. And finally, I'm working on a statement on victims' rights to serve as a common point of reference for all UN personnel, as well as the individuals and communities we serve. This might seem to be an abstract project, but my experience over the years has shown that naming rights, actually recognizing and communicating to victims that they do have rights is extremely empowering. I could go on about the progress that we have seen, but I think we've got time to address that in question and answer, and I don't want to hold up the questions and comments that participants might need to make. But I think you say that I'm, I suppose, a frank person, and I will be very frank here. We've got a lot to do. My mapping has shown in my field visits that adequate and quality services for victims, medical, psychosocial and legal assistance and livelihood support are lacking, especially in remote areas. And victims themselves have a profound gap in their knowledge of what services they should be able to access. A big challenge, and one which really dogs our reputation, is realising victims' rights to justice and accountability and remedies, and I can go into that. But in conclusion, at this outset point, I think we have to be very open about our shortcomings so we can find effective solutions. We must collaborate across the system. The UN must really be one. And we must ensure that all humanitarian actors are fully engaged in this agenda. So I'll stop at that point and look forward to the many comments and questions I'm sure that will be forthcoming.
Well, thank you very much, Jen. Actually, we are getting a lot of questions, which obviously will also help everybody understand the progress, but also the challenges. I will start with, I think, the most simple one, and I can tell you the others are a bit more challenging. And I will address it to Isabella. Isabella, can you raise the issue about the role of GBV actors compared to PSEA actors? And if you have seen promising practices in a country where the GBV actors are focused on the strengthening of the referral pathways and access to services for survivors. Can you please address that, Isabella? Over to you.
Thank you, Najat. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. So that's a very important question with a lot of operational implications. So thank you for those who have raised it. I mean, the key issue here is that is one of complementarity, really. So making sure that PSEA, the PSEA coordination system on the ground is complementary to GBV services. Obviously, investment in GBV services, and I would add, of course, child protection services as well, is absolutely critical to ensure that SCA survivors can have their needs addressed. And one of the efforts during these last years has been precisely to make sure that PSEA networks, so all those agencies that are contributing on the ground to the PSEA agenda, have integrated GBV referral pathways in their work. The mapping I was alluding to earlier of the 34 countries with humanitarian operations indicated that there are over close to 56% of PSEA networks that have already integrated GBV referral pathways in their work, and that's something that we would see as a significant achievement, and we would like to see in all operations. In Mozambique, the PSEA network, for instance, has worked very closely with the GBV subcluster to precisely to integrate referral pathways into the various complaint procedures. So in other countries, in Iraq as well, there has been a great investment in strengthening GBV services that has also obviously served the PSEA agenda. So that's, I mean, another point that maybe is useful for all of us to reflect on is the importance of distinguishing the role of a PSEA coordinator from from that of the GBV subcluster coordinator in terms of, because in light of that complementarity that I explained earlier, there are obviously specific accountabilities that the GBV subcluster has, and which are distinct from those of the PSEA coordination system, and must be protected in that sense. I will stop here, Najat. I hope this helps. Hello, Najat?
Do you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, we are really getting a lot of questions, and I can cluster them in 3 categories. The first one is really about UN restrictive approach to, and I quote, to the sentimental relations of humanitarian staff with beneficiaries. And as far as the previous Secretary Bolton, the wording was discouraged. And so the question, and I will address it to you, Jane, will the UN upcoming statements of victims' rights simply be a declaration of ideals, or will victim rights be clearly codified and enforceable? Over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Najat. Do you want me to address the sentimental relationship question first before we move on to the second?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, and I think this is relevant for Isabella, because the IASC Principals, of course, were there first, and they reflect this sort of restriction with regard to relationships with not beneficiaries so much, but those who are nationals or those with whom UN personnel come in contact. As you know, the notion is that we have a situation of unequal power relations, and in that context, relationships with beneficiaries are perceived as, by and large, sexual exploitation or abuse, depending on the age of the beneficiary. This was codified, of course, in the 2003 SGB. This has been under discussion for some time, and I myself would hope that there would be a little more clarity with regard to this, and the discouraged might become a little more significant rather than just being discouraged. As from my point of view, the likelihood of equal relationships between UN personnel and those they serve is unlikely. But I think Isabella will have something to add with regard to this, because there has been some change with regard to the IASC principles. Let me just talk about the statement of victims' rights very briefly. It is not possible for me, of course, to codify rights, because that would be something that would be in the gift of member states of the United Nations. But what this seeks to do, and it will go beyond aspirational. It will in clear terms, identify the responsibilities that the United Nations has with regard to those who complain of sexual exploitation and abuse, with respect to reporting, investigation, follow-up, and so on. And it will also clarify, and I think we often forget this, the real responsibilities and duties of member states of the United Nations with regard to their with regard to certainly uniformed personnel and civilians who breach the requirements, their personal requirements with regard to their conduct, the wrongs that they perpetrate with respect to beneficiaries and others. So I'm not in a position, obviously, to create rights. I'm not seeking to create new rights, but I'm seeking to make it extremely clear for all concerned what the responsibilities, and there are existing responsibilities of the UN that we all know well about, and the clear responsibilities of member states in this regard. I hope that we will be able to have, we've been working quite hard on this for months indeed, and I hope that we'll be able to have something that we'll be able to show to all very shortly. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jen. We are getting a lot of questions actually about the reporting and how effective it is and how this should be done, the assistance to the victims, but also the entitlement. So I think we should continue with the questions, so that way we can really address the concerns of the participants, if you don't mind, Jen and Isabella. Is that okay with you?
Sure, Najat.
Excellent. So let me address to you, Isabella, this question. What is the role that should be played by the humanitarian coordinators, the HCTs, and other humanitarian actors to ensure actually all what you have been presenting, you and Jane, just before? Because from the questions we are getting, it looks like there is a lot of skepticism there. So counting on you to convince everybody. Over to you, Isabella.
Thank you, Najat. I'm not sure I can convince everybody, but I can certainly say with a high degree of confidence that there is a strong commitment from the humanitarian leadership to make to deliver on this agenda, and that remains absolutely critical for the success of this agenda. So the plan for accelerating action at the country level foresees also a coordination structure to sustain these efforts, and this is a coordination structure where obviously the humanitarian coordinators will have to continue playing a critical role in terms of ensuring that there is a coherent and consistent and well coordinated system in place in any given country facing a humanitarian crisis. So this would entail having a PSEA network in place, having particularly in a major humanitarian crisis, dedicated PSEA coordinators capacity, and that's I'm pleased actually to mention that we expect to soon have PSEA coordinators in 26 out of the 34 countries with humanitarian response. So that's substantive progress since the 2018 mapping I was referring to earlier. What is critical really is to make sure that all these efforts are systematically embedded in all the humanitarian planning cycles. So we must make sure, and once again the humanitarian coordinators will have a critical role to play, that all our efforts around this agenda are fully reflected, integrated in the humanitarian response plans, in refugee response plans, budgeted and costed and budgeted accordingly. I think that's really a critical point for all of us to retain, because this is not a time-bound commitment or a small project. This is something that has to become really part and parcel of our work, and really the part of the cost of doing business in any humanitarian crisis. And unless we do that, we will not be able to continue and sustain this work over time.
Isabella, are you done?
Yes. Yes,
okay,
yes, over to you, Najat.
Thank you very much. Jen, I turn to you now. I mean, I will start with the very simple questions, and then I will go to the more complicated one. The very simple question is about who holds the role of the victim rights advocates in countries where there is no designated focal point for this. Over to you, Jen.
Thank you very much. That's an extremely good question. Currently, as I said, we have field victims' rights advocates in 4 countries. I have to say that we only have one dedicated field victims' rights advocate at the moment. The rest of them are double, triple-hatted. And that is not ideal. We can see from the impact of the dedicated field victims' rights advocate, and indeed from the work of the field victims' rights advocates who are not dedicated, that this makes a big difference, having somebody who is tasked with victims' rights functions. The Secretary-General had asked that others be appointed in contexts where they are warranted, and as far as I can see from my visits, all contexts warrant someone with victims' rights advocacy functions. Naturally, money is not overwhelming, so it's quite difficult to push to have dedicated field victims' rights advocates, but I am advocating as far as I can to have them created in certain contexts. But I do believe that somebody should have victims' rights advocacy functions in wherever we operate. And I follow up the statement of Isabella with regard to the importance of having dedicated prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse task force coordinators. And I would argue that that function could be added to a dedicated PSEA task force coordinators functions, and also, of course, obviously supported by myself and the network of field victims' rights advocates that we have at the moment. So the short answer is, in a context where there is no field victims' rights advocate, there is no one with victims' rights advocacy skills as part and parcel of their general work, but of course, the work that we're seeking to do is to indeed entrench the notion of focus on the victims rather than focus on the issues with respect to reputation and, well, focus on those to a certain extent, but reshift our focus so we prioritize the victims. Can you just remind me of the second question you posed?
I did not pose it yet, so I'm going to do it now.
Right. So we start with the easy and move into the more complicated.
Exactly.
Good idea.
And actually, for your information, we still have almost 10 questions. So let's try to address all of that.
Yes.
Yeah. So the second question is about what specific enforceable rights is a victim of sexual assault abuse entitled to demand from the UN, and to what specific office a person can can the victim appeal? Over to you, Jen.
With regard to, and we're talking of victims of sexual exploitation and abuse only here, and I think we should be very clear that there's a difference between victims of, so issues may be similar in some ways, victims of sexual harassment and sexual exploitation and abuse. With regard to the rights, I suppose, rights is a difficult way to put it in some ways. We certainly have a comprehensive strategy, pretty old, adopted in 2007 by the General Assembly on assistance to victims of sexual, assistance and support to victims of sexual exploitation and abuse. I have to say, this is limited in scope and duration to basic and additional assistance and support as necessary. And one of the big issues about this is it is not funded. In the context of missions, instructions exist that funding should be provided out of mission funds to provide the support and assistance which is outlined in that comprehensive strategy. But in that context, certainly we are moving forward, and I'm sure Isabella can speak to this. We've almost finalized the draft victims assistance protocol developed by UNICEF, Conduct and Discipline, and of course ourselves, which aims to provide consistent direction for the UN system of the provision of assistance and support to victims. With regard to what rights can they demand, they can certainly demand all of the assistance and support that is set out in the comprehensive strategy, and they can certainly demand the assistance and support that one would be able to demand if you were complaining of a wrong in any other context. So it would be an initial support and assistance, medical, psychosocial, legal, if that were available. And then following that, they can demand assistance with regard to investigation and the pursuance of the investigation. In terms of accountability, legal accountability, as all in the webinar will be aware, legal accountability in general terms lies in the hands of states. This is where we need to be far more not so much aggressive, but we need to really engage with states more so that they step up to the plate with regard to the accountability, legal accountability of their nationals, as with regard to the United Nations system. Our sanctions are disciplinary, administrative, and that must be clear to all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. You have addressed a number of other questions, so we have less than 10 now. Isabella, let me turn to you. There is a very specific question about the Interagency Standing Committee standards, which actually included guidance on setting up victim support mechanism in the field. So the question is, what is the experience with these, and what have you learned that will make a difference to future victim-centered initiatives? Over to you, Isabella.
Thank you, Najat. Well, that's a big question. I mean, there has been, I think we are still, sorry to sound a bit negative, but I think we are still lagging behind in terms of securing comprehensive assistance to victims in a way that would really address all their needs. In those countries where, of course, and I go back to the point I had made earlier, in those countries where there has been investment in GBV services, where there has been investment in child protection services as well, we have been able to see obviously more progress. One challenge that I think we are still facing is how to make sure that these services are available nationwide. I was recently in South Sudan, and it's obvious that whereas it may be relatively easier to establish referral pathways and access to services in specific locations, like in the South Sudan context, protection of civilian sites, as soon as you get out to the larger communities, it's obviously clearly still a huge challenge to ensure access to those services. And I would say that from a UNICEF perspective, the investment that we are trying to make in the countries where we work in terms of really strengthening existing national systems and services is critical, and will continue to be critical to ensure that we are able to deliver on those accountabilities as well. Unfortunately, when I look at some of the funding available for protection, GBV services across the board, I can see that we are still lagging behind. Just to give you a concrete example, GBV continues to be across the board 10% funded only in across the various humanitarian response plan, and child protection is also lagging behind in terms of funding. So that's something that I think we have to continue advocating for very firmly. If you don't mind, Najat, I would like, it's not connected to services, but I would like briefly to go back to an important question that was raised earlier in relation to the change of the language related to sexual relationships between humanitarian workers and quote-unquote beneficiaries of assistance. There has been some progress within the ISC. There have been extensive consultations over the last several months on the revision of Principle 4 that is related precisely to this point. We have come to a language that represents a minimum standard for all ISC agencies, which prohibits sexual relationships between beneficiaries and between those providing assistance and protection and those benefiting from such assistance and protection, when such relationships are based on unequal power dynamics. Several members of the ISC community have noted that this is indeed a minimum standard, as the majority of or many of the ISC members have stricter, even stricter language in their code of conducts and in their code of conducts. But I would say that's already an important progress, and we are really committed to take these forward in the months to come in terms of ensuring dissemination and implementation. Over to you, Najat.
Well, thank you very much, Isabella. I mean, I'm going to group the next three questions because it's really all about the protection of the witnesses and the victims and how we can actually better encourage the reporting. And the last chunk is really how the work in prevention and in investigation is really impacting and making things better for the victims. So I turn to you, Jen. I promised a challenging question, so now it's yours.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
So the question is really how are you developing safe and accessible reporting mechanisms at a collective level, appropriate to the culture, and how can you encourage reporting from the most vulnerable? And the last part is how the victim rights advocate function improve things for victims. Over to you.
Thank you very much. There is sort of mixed bag of questions, of course, and with regard to reporting, and Isabella will be able to complement here, multiple reporting pathways are becoming available through community-based complaint networks and communications technologies. So we have multiple reporting pathways available. With regard to reporting, my personal view is that reporting is unlikely to occur, and we have reporting, of course. We don't have enormous numbers of reports of sexual exploitation and abuse, but from my point of view, reporting is unlikely to occur unless we do much more to ensure that those who seek to report feel that they are protected. They are protected from reprisals from their families, their communities, and they are also treated when they report with dignity and respect. They are believed at the outset, and then they are treated in terms of investigation in the highest level, at the highest level, underlining the do no harm principle. What we tend to find with reporting also is that sometimes people will, well, many times people will withdraw their reports, often because of some form of some sort of benefit is offered to them, and of course reprisals. So, and in addition, I do not believe that we will have the amount of reporting that we need to have, because unless you have reporting, you're not in a position to address individual wrongs. You're not in a position to address prevention in an appropriate way. We will not have reporting unless those who report can be assured that they will be able to receive the services and assistance that they require. And as I said earlier, based on my visits, based on our mapping exercise that we've been undertaking, we have a lot of work to do, and a lot of work to do together, working as the UN as one, working with our partners to ensure that support, medical, psychosocial, legal, livelihood support for people to rebuild their lives is available to them. Notwithstanding this, I have to say that there is a lot of work ongoing, certainly with the joint investigators' work within the Chief Executives Board and IASC framework to develop guidelines that are victim-centered on also within the context of the IASC to improve survivor support. But we really have to be clear with ourselves. We've got a lot to do. Reporting prevention depends on support. Reporting depends on support, and dignity and respect for rights and entrenchment of rights will encourage reporting, will lead to prevention. If I'm sure I've forgotten things, but please remind me, Najat.
I'll come back to you, Dan. You have addressed a lot of what was in the question, but I would like Isabella to elaborate more on prevention, because we have focused a lot on the key priorities, on the response, but how can we prevent better? Over to you, Isabella.
Thank you, Najat. Thank you for colleagues who have asked this question, because indeed prevention is a critical part of the whole equation, and definitely there is more that needs to be done. Let me complement James on the issue of reporting. We are obviously facing challenges with under-reporting, and one of the reasons is obviously because there are no because victim survivors do not feel safe speaking up and coming forward, and it's clear that we need to address the many barriers to reporting, and one of those is one way to do that, in addition to, of course, continue the investment in multiple entry points for reporting at community level, and designing those entry points for reporting together with communities, is addressing the social norms, the behaviors, the culture that really ultimately is the breeding ground for these violations. I'm very pleased that this is a key area of work that has been identified by our UNHCR colleagues in their championship agenda. So there is a lot of promising work and initiatives that will support in that respect. And I would like to mention one in particular, which is really working with ISC members to address the lack of resources or expertise to develop materials, that outreach and communication materials that can really support victims and survivors in coming forward. I have seen this myself in many countries where I worked in my previous assignments, and I think in investing in those in prevention activities and working at a community level, and mobilizing communities around these issues to raise their awareness, and in particular making sure that this is done in a way that is really understandable and accessible to them is absolutely critical. And if I may add very quickly, one thing that an additional aspect where I think a much greater investment is needed is how do we localize all those efforts? How do we make sure that in those contexts where there are many layers of remoteness between us as agencies and those delivering services on the ground, we are able to really capacitate civil society organizations at the lowest possible level in undertaking this work. So that's something that I would certainly like to see happening more and more in the months and years to come. Back to you, Najat. There were I'm sure other issues that I haven't covered, so if you could remind me of what were the other questions.
No, you covered a lot of the issues and about the questions we got. There were some 2-3 questions about the investigation and how actually this is handled, and if the UN Justice is involved. So I mean, I think it's a question to both of you. So Isabella, since you have the floor, maybe you can address that, and then I will ask Jen to complement what you said, but also to address the second question, which is about how do we deal with the national authorities to request protection from retaliation against victims. Over to you, Isabella, and then Jen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Najat. I think Jane mentioned already a couple of issues with regard to investigation. That is that there has been important work done as a result of joint efforts between the ISC and the CEB around strengthening survivor-centered investigations. There was recently an event in Geneva that brought together investigators from different agencies precisely to look at what are the areas that need to be strengthened and how we can work together to make sure that this part of the work is also implemented in a much more effective way and obviously victim-centered way. Maybe a few examples, concrete examples that I can think of in countries like CAR and in Central African Republic, in DRC. UNICEF has worked closely with service providers to ensure access to psychosocial support to children during investigations in a way that has been joined up actually with the Office of Internal Oversight Services. There is work around development of global standard operating procedures on the protection and support to victims and witnesses of SEA during investigations, and this is work that will be carried forward through Results Group 2 within the ISC coordination structure. So there has been also progress. OIOS has been working with children's rights specialized organizations to develop materials and trainings to support investigators in making to strengthen their capacities when conducting investigations related to SEA incidents. So there is I think that there is a clear recognition that this is an area that requires additional investment. Is one of the 3 priority outcome areas in the ISC plan for accelerating action at the country level. So I'm hopeful that this will continue to be a priority and that we will be able to benchmark our progress against some very concrete indicators and going forward. Over to you, Najat.
Thank you very much, Isabella. We will have to close in 2 minutes, and Jen, so I really would like you to have the last word and maybe address also how we deal with the national authorities And I'm sorry to all the participants who have not been able to address all your questions, but the presentation will be shared with you. And if you need anything else, please let us know, and we'll make sure to convey your concerns to our two speakers. Jane, over to you.
Thank you very much, Najat, and I think I really am grateful for the interest, and I think this shows that we can follow up and perhaps chop things into bits, because there's a lot of overlapping, but at the same time, as we see with regard, for example, how to conduct investigations, I think this would benefit from a webinar of its own. And just to complement Isabella's comments and remarks with regard to this, the investigators are pulling together guidelines for investigations in the context of sexual exploitation and abuse, and also in sexual harassment, which is victim-centered. There's a lot they can work from the national level, and I'm very hopeful, and I know that there has been consultation across the system and with the humanitarian sector, with civil society and so on, and I'm very hopeful that these can be very strong, very action-oriented. With regard to national authorities, I think this is national authorities essentially have the absolute duty and responsibility to protect the people at the national level. This we have to really engage with national authorities at a greater level. Often we do not do so. And one of the areas that I think, and which I push very much for, is to strengthen what is available at the national level. And often what is available at the national level is a national human rights institution. We have over 112 across the whole world, and we have many in context in where we work. And frequently we do not turn our attention to the fact that they stand between government and the civil society sector, and are in a very good position, if properly resourced, if properly capacitated, to provide advocacy with regard to the national authorities, and also to provide support and protection for victims, including of sexual exploitation and abuse, and also to take their complaints in certain contexts. So I really believe that we need to strengthen our messages with regard to national authorities, to work with what is on the ground, not to seek to reinvent the wheel. National human rights institutions, grassroots civil society, national civil society, so that we can indeed entrench the message in national authorities' minds that they are responsible for the protection of the people in their countries. Thank you so much. I'm sorry to have taken more than 1 minute perhaps, but thank you so much, Najat and your colleagues. Thank you, Isabella, and thank you to everybody who participated. I look forward to seeing other questions. I'm always open to being in contact with people, and have a great day, great evening, or whatever, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane and Isabella, for your contribution. That was really very substantive and very interesting. Thanks to the several hundreds of humanitarians who connected from around the world for being there. I'm sorry we could not have a longer webinar, but again, please send us your questions. We will share with you the presentation, the PowerPoint presentation, and any other document that the speakers would like to share with you. I hope to see you or to have you with us in our next webinar, which is on the 6th of November, and that will be about engagement with non-state actors. Thank you very much to all. Have a good morning, afternoon, evening, and night for those who are going to sleep. Thank you.